Again, apologize. I know this isn't ideal, but we'll see how this works. So I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about the something that I think is trending upward here in North Dakota. For the last 5 or 6 years, we've been testing some different ways to get cover crops into some of our cropping systems. And the more and more we test, the more I'm convinced that the best way to get success with a cover crop is to use it during your year with corn. So we've done a number of trials now, ranging from herbicide interactions to some different ways of grazing, different planting methods and whatnot. And so I'm going to share some of that with you today, and hope that you get something out of this. So I'm going to first kind of clarify a little bit about what I'm talking about. So when we say we're going to plant cover crops mid-season into corn, this is something like what it looks like. We use pretty small equipment in research plots, but the bottom line is we're retrofitting equipment in order to meet these needs. So we're planting our cover crops into corn with existing equipment that's been modified in a way that allows us to plant between the rows. And we're generally trying to get 2 to 3 rows planted between each 30-inch row. As you can see on the screen, we've kind of worked with a type of press drill as well as a plate planter in order to get these cover crops planted. And we do suggest planting kind of around V4 to 6 in the corn. That's kind of been proven to not cause any yield impacts when we're planting our cover crops at that point. It also is a good time to get seed moisture. So one of the problems with planting cover crops after a cereal is that sometimes we're really dry, or sometimes it's a short fall, and so you don't necessarily get the full benefit of the cover crop. By planting at the end of June, we kind of take some of that risk away, and we've had very good luck getting cover crops established in corn when they're seeded. That's not the case when it's broadcast. You can still broadcast seed in corn, and depending on the type, you may have success with it. But if you want to reduce the risk of cover crop stand loss, direct seeding is highly recommended. So I guess this kind of goes over a lot of what I just said, but one of the keys to having the system work well is still being able to utilize your herbicide program. So by applying in mid-season, we can go in and get a mid-season herbicide application before we plant our cover crop. Right, so we're putting these cover crops into a clean slate. And then not only does it start clean, but if you have a residual product included in there that isn't overly detrimental to your cover crop, you can also have your herbicide plus cover crop to increase your level of weed control even more. And I think this is especially important against some of today's weeds like water hemp and Palmer amaranth, which are notorious for late emergence and very rapid growth late in the season when we're not able to do any further applications in our corn. So by having the cover crop and mid-season residual herbicide, we're really giving our best chance at reducing weed seed sets. I'm going to present some results here shortly from a study, but just for some background on that, what we're doing is, again, we're planting our cover crop around V5, And this year it was around the end of June when that happened. And we applied our herbicide about 10 days prior to that. Then we did several evaluations afterward. So before I get into some of the herbicide specific things, I wanted to just to give you a little bit better visual of what we're looking at here. So in the next several set of pictures, we have different cover crop species. On the left-hand side, we have cover crops that are growing in somewhat of a gap where the sunlight is hitting the ground. And on the right-hand side is an area that has full shade. So this is later in the season, I think around end of August or middle of August maybe. In each of the pictures, you'll be able to see the left-hand side where you get sun, the crop looks much different than it does on the right-hand side. But to kind of help you gauge the success of a cover crop, I was kind of rating the tolerance, right? So in this case, we have lentils, which are a nice legume to have in a lot of cover crop mixtures, but they don't do well when we have those nice full corn canopies and lots of shade. So their shade tolerance is not very good. Next species, flax. Flax is a really nice species for corn because it actually has a lot of the same tolerances to herbicides as corn does, outside of Roundup and Liberty and some of those products. But it actually has really good tolerance to HPPD inhibitors, for instance. So you really don't have to change much of anything when you're working with flax and corn. But again, unfortunately, shade tolerance is not really good at all. So you can see the plants are pretty wimpy there, but they're still there. So they're doing something. Okay, winter rye. You can see here we're planting the winter rye in the summertime, so the plants are not interested in heading out. They're staying vegetative here. And when you look comparisons from the left to the right, you see not nearly as big of a difference as you did in the previous pictures. So this is something that is medium tolerant. There's still going to be some growth and biomass potential here, even under full shade. Okay, oats. I was actually pretty happy with the oats. So you can see on the left-hand side, we have our oats growing in full sunlight. They're heading out. On the right-hand side, they are it's actually a fair amount of biomass still, but they are not heading out. So I think that's a really interesting and important aspect of an annual cereal that could be included in here, from the perspective of you don't have to worry too much about, or nearly as much about, seed set as you would as if the oats were growing freely in sunlight. And the other nice thing about oats is they too share an awful lot of herbicide tolerance to corn. So you won't have to change your herbicide program much if you have oats as a cover crop in corn. Crimson clover. In full sunlight, it is absolutely gorgeous underneath the canopy. But when you have the shade, it's not bad. It's better than the flax and the lentils performance-wise. So we're giving this a medium, although you can clearly see it doesn't look quite as good as something like the oats did when you compare the two. Okay, radish. Again, this is something I consider medium tolerance. Radish works, and same with turnips coming up next. Here they both work pretty well with a number of herbicide programs, but there's definitely going to be some red flags, I think, with these species. The one thing I want you to note on the left-hand side here is all the leaf damage, which came from flea beetles. Okay, I'll come back to that in a minute. All right, now, so the one thing I want to point out besides shade tolerance, there's some other things the person needs to consider when planting a cover crop in the middle of the season that you may not consider as much at the end of the season. This year in particular, we had some really bad flea beetle pressure in the middle of the season. And on the right-hand side is a dryland site. On the left-hand side is an irrigated site. So you can see on the right hand, we did get cover crop establishment. Wasn't a perfect stand, but we got the cover crops in there. But what happened was the flea beetles moved in and really did not let those plants take off until very late in the season. They did eventually come back, but they were doing essentially nothing for a lot of the season. On the left-hand side, with more water, the cover crops were able to outgrow any damage that the flea beetles were causing. So the cover crop actually still turned out pretty well. Something to keep in mind when radishes and turnips, they're related to canola, so they're definitely susceptible to flea beetle damage at different times. Okay, and then one more twist. So there's different ways to implement this. If a person was really interested and really serious about the cover crop aspect of corn production, you could consider wide row corn. And so kind of what's going on is you get wide rows, you get more sunlight hitting the ground, and then you see some of those shade impacts from before, those go away, you get a lot more growth, okay? But there's also, give and take. So with the wide rows, there's also potential for more weed growth. And also, I'm going to say more potential injury due to herbicides, because the more something is growing, the more potential it has to take up and display herbicide injury symptoms. So it's also somewhat of an evolving strategy. So there's a lot we don't know about how to manage the 60-inch rows to the best of their ability, but I think there's more potential for yield loss. We've seen some people have really aggressive cover crops, and that can cause yield loss in itself. There's also potential yield loss due to taking on a new strategy, and there's a learning curve, right? But on the other hand, depending on what you want to do, with the wide rows, you get more cover crop growth, more soil biology, and it's definitely much more grazing friendly. So for the livestock producer, this is definitely something that's a lot more intriguing, I think, than a pure cropper. Okay. So all that aside, I'm happy to share this. Essentially, we'll call it preliminary right now, but here's the results from this year's test on looking at herbicide combinations with different cover crops in corn. So again, these products would have been applied mid-season, so around V4, and the herbicides were applied, then the cover crops were planted around 10 days later. And this is kind of what we saw. So here's a chart, simple as possible. Anything that's low risk, we had less than 20% injury. We didn't have any high risk, but we did have a few medium risk situations here where we saw injury in the range of 20 to 50%. Okay, and I think these designations are important because we saw a lot of minor injury to cover crops, but it was less than 20%. And I think for most people, that's a very acceptable level of injury to cover crops. It's not going to affect overall biomass to a large degree, and you may not even notice it unless you have those side-by-side comparisons. Medium risk is definitely noticeable injury, and that can be either stand loss or biomass reduction. Usually it's some combination of both. So a couple of things here that stand out on this chart. We have wide match, understandably causing some problems with our legume species. Crimson clover is one of the more sensitive cover crop species that we tested here. And it also caused problems with radish, which wouldn't necessarily be something that I would have thought of ahead of time. But nevertheless, there was some injury that showed up there. So wide match is always going to be one of those products that's a little bit of a concern in cover crop programs. Okay. The other thing that's interesting here, so we had atrazine, dual, and callisto tested independently, and there was definitely minor injury with some of that cover crop species with those three products, but it wasn't too significant. But now we use a combination of all three of those, which is most of the components of like Acuron. And now we increase our injury potential a little bit. So, in corn, there's lots of products that have 3 or 4-way mixtures. And you can definitely see how, even though individually some of those products might be okay in these cover crop mixes, when you start combining modes of action, you can see some increased level of injury. But that's how they're designed, right? It works that way on the weeds too. You have multiple modes of action, you should see better weed control as well. So that's somewhat by design when you start mixing products. The one thing I will say about this is a good start. This is just 1 year. We're hoping to get hopefully up to 5 years worth of data into this, so we can start to get a better handle on where we're going to see injury. For instance, I would expect that in most cases we're going to see wide match injury to lentil. That's not a combination I would recommend. We didn't see a high level of injury this year, but that's just one example of something I would be concerned about. Okay, so what are some things that are going to affect the injury level we might get in our cover crops? So the first two I think are kind of givens. The rate of herbicide that we use, along with the time after application. So I'm going to get into half-life briefly here in the next couple slides, which has to do with the time after application. The other things that environmentally that affect herbicide injury are soil organic matter, pH, texture, soil moisture, the rate of growth or biomass of your crop, and heat units, and all these environmental effects are tied in, at least in some way, to the microbial activity of your soil. A lot of the products that we're looking at here are degraded by microbial activity more than anything else. Again, that's a generalization, but things that are generally favorable for microbial activity are going to increase the rate of herbicide breakdown. Okay, so I really should just eliminate most of the information on here. What I want to point to is kind of on the right-hand side of this chart. We have looking at a few different active ingredients of our herbicides and some different half-lives. So here we tested different cover crop species, looking at simulated half-lives by applying rates that are much lower than what would be normally applied. So a half-life is the amount of time it takes for half of the product to disappear in a field. So some things I just wanted to point you to. Everything we just saw in the previous slide affects the half-life, right? So clopyralid, which is in wide match, half of that product can be gone anywhere from 12 to 70 days, depending on some of the variables previously. All right, so potentially 2 months after application, you might still have half of the product in the soil, or 2 weeks after, you might have half the product out of your soil. Okay, and then you look at essentially much lower rates down to 0.7 ounces. There you're looking anywhere from about a third of a year up to 2 years in duration where that product might still be there. So there's an awful lot of variability in how these products break down, and that's going to affect our cover crops, just like it'll affect cash crop herbicide carryover problems, right? And so bottom line is here, there's a huge range of potential outcomes depending on our herbicide application. Okay. And then just for those of you that are interested in looking at some of the symptoms, I just had a couple slides here showing some of the different symptoms of Acuron on some clovers down kind of on the left hand. We have two pictures of lentils, and then our radish up here on the right. So anything from bleaching, or that center picture up here, you can see the plants emerged and then essentially died back. Okay, we're not going to talk about pursuit. That's not a corn product. Wide match is very predictable. It's kind of fun to test this out in the greenhouse. You can see very clear rate responses when we look at our check on the left-hand side, our lowest rate, and then all the way up to our half X of a normal use rate on the right-hand side. So in all cases, the plants come out of the ground, and then they gradually start taking on symptoms and die back, depending on the rate. Now on the right-hand side is flax, showing starane injury, something you probably rarely ever would notice out in the field. Just something I wanted to point out, that flax is sensitive to starane, and under certain circumstances, may be potential for injury, but something that's very likely only picked up in the greenhouse. Okay, so all this said, what products are cover crop friendly in corn? This slide here, I have products that I would consider low risk. So the chart I had before is a good starter, but that's certainly not all inclusive, and neither is this. This is just a little bit further guidance on what I would suggest based on what we did this year and what I probably would expect later on. So low risk products, any group 1, all of our grass products, Select, Assure, those type of things, 100% safe on our cover crop species, as long as they're applied before planting the cover crop. Along with glyphosate, glufosinate, those are okay. Dual, I think it'd be pretty rare to see our cover crops with a high level of injury to dual. There could be some potential with a few small seeded species, but I'm pretty comfortable with that product. MCPA, Outlook, Acetochlor, Saflufenicil or Sharpen. These are products where I'm not going to say you're never going to see injury, but I'm not too worried about them. Same with the Ziduit products if they're applied pre-emergence to corn. So products that I would worry a little bit more about, I have Zidua on here as well, if it's included as a post product to corn, as well as Valor, 2,4-D, and Dicamba. I think in most cases, these products aren't going to cause too many issues either, but there's just a little bit more risk in these than on the previous list. The products I would be a lot more concerned about would be wide match, and especially if you have any legume in your mixture, I would try to avoid wide match. Mesotrione, what we're seeing so far is that there's probably going to be some injury on a lot of our cover crop species, but this one's somewhat biomass dependent. And so the plants need to be growing a fair amount in order to take on a lot of these symptoms. So there's a good chance you'll see some injury on especially the broadleaf cover crops. But sometimes that injury may not be enough to cause problems, but it certainly could. And then as well as some of the other HPPD and atrazine products. So again, there's always exceptions, right? I wouldn't be too worried about these products if we're using flax, oats, or rye. or a lot of other cereals for that matter. Even if you see some injury, I think for the most part, these products are going to work out with a lot of herbicide programs. These cover crops work with a lot of herbicide programs in corn. Okay, so with that, thanks for your time. I hope the sound came through okay, and I'll take any questions you might have.
Hi, Mike. Thank you. Is there any reason you use the paired rows between the corn rows instead of a single row in the middle of the corn rows?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's a good question. You certainly could use one. I think if you're using a planter, it's going to be a lot easier to use a single row in the middle of a corn 30-inch row. And I mean, and that's, again, depending on what your goals are, that could be okay. I think just from a pure agronomic standpoint, having that second row between them just fills out the space a lot better. So what I'll say is 2 rows is better. 1 row is okay, right? And depending on what equipment is, I mean, what I like to tell people is I don't want to see people buying expensive equipment to go out and plant cover crops because, you know, people are already questioning return on investment. So whatever we can do to get these cover crops in the ground in an inexpensive way, especially if you already have the equipment to do it, I think that's a win. So 1 row is okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.